Good evening. What a wonderful and buzzy crowd you are. My name is Tony Fisher. I serve this congregation here as minister. The Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Greater Naples is a welcoming congregation, freely seeking intellectual and spiritual growth, striving to create a larger community of peace, justice, and love. And we are extremely grateful to be hosting Katherine Stewart tonight, extremely grateful for Americans United for making this happen, and for the Interfaith Alliance in co-sponsoring, and especially for you to be here. Katherine will speak. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A. The separation of church and state is something that's important to those of us who really understand what it means, that we get to be who we are, and Unitarian Universalists are on the very liberal end of the spectrum of religious traditions, and could be easily targeted by an administration that would like to keep things very much the way they want them. So we're very much in favor of the separation of church and state. I speak about it often, and I'm grateful for Katherine to be here. This is the second time she's spoken to us. A couple of years ago, maybe 3, she spoke to us on Zoom in one of our forums, which happened after our Sunday services. So welcome. I do want to remind you that we also have a lecture series starts in February and goes into March called Progressive Voices Speak Out. It's very much in this same kind of format. And we know that we have one of our speakers here this evening, Corey Lewis from WGCU, who will be speaking with us during one of those lectures. So we're grateful to have you here. And information about that speaking series will be coming out pretty quickly. So watch your various channels. And I think both of these organizations help us spread the word about those. Once again, welcome again. And I'm very proud and happy to introduce Bill Corson, the president of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State here in Collier County.
Thank you, and oh, what a wonderful turnout tonight. Thank you very much for coming out. Before we begin, cell phones, if you haven't silenced your cell phone, we'd appreciate it if you would do that now. Isn't that the normal first announcement? Silence those cell phones. Before we begin, we should note that today is a special day in American history. In 1919, it was identified as Armistice Day. It ended the Great War. In 1954, it was changed to Veterans Day. And so I'd ask you to bow your heads for a moment of silence for a recognition of all those who served. Thank you very much. Before you introduce Katherine, I just have a lot of thank yous, so I hope you'll bear with me. First, I'd like to thank the boards of the Naples chapter of Americans United for separation of church and state, and also the board of the Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida. If those members of those boards could please just stand for a second and be recognized. Thank you. The Interfaith Alliance is relatively new, but boy, have they been active in this area. And I'd like to recognize Sharon Harris Ewing, the president. Where is she? Sharon, would you just rise? I'd also like to thank Reverend Tony Fisher. You all know Tony. And the board for the UU for making this venue available. I've been through a lot of congregations in my life, and I have to say this is the most caring congregation I've ever seen. You people are wonderful. So you should give yourselves a hand, actually. I'd like to thank Gene Goldberg and Bill Pettinger for hosting Katherine. They've made her stay very memorable. I'd like to also, we have her books are available outside. I think you've all seen that. And this is a new bookstore. It's called Books on Third. It's an independent bookstore. And so Katherine's books are available after the presentation, and she's willing to sign the books. So after we're done, go buy those books. Okay. I'd also like to recognize Rita and Bernie Turner. I think a lot of you knew Rita and Bernie. They were the conscience of our chapter, and may their memories always serve as a blessing. And lastly, thank you to those who donated to help fund this evening. Whenever I'm asked to speak, I always tell the audience that there are 2 books that they have to read. If you want to know what's going on and how this whole system works, 2 books. The first is Dark Money by Jane Mayer. The second is The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism by our guest speaker, Katherine Stewart. If you don't have those books, go buy them and read them. They're very important. And Katherine is here tonight to talk about her new book, Money Lies in God. So it's our pleasure and our honor to introduce Katherine Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. That was such a warm welcome, and I gather you've gone through many of the thanks, so I don't have to ask the AU board members to stand up again, but I'm very grateful to Americans United and, of course, to Reverend Sharon Harris-Ewing and the Interfaith Alliance, and, of course, Reverend Tony Fisher. He said I can call him Tony. It's really encouraging to see these various groups coming together because we are stronger together. You know, supposed to be, supposed to be here in 2022 in person, but Hurricane Ivan disrupted those plans. So I'm here now. I brought the cold weather, but at least it's not a hurricane. So before we get started, I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you saw the ICE protesters in Portland dressed as chickens and rabbits and frogs? Okay, that's great. How many of you saw the naked bike ride protest in Portland? I see even more hands there, shockingly. I mean, it's funny. I laugh too. As they say, Portland isn't a war zone. It's a bookstore surrounded by a coffee shop and then wrapped in a city. But what we're seeing in America is not funny today, not funny at all. Remember, Trump sold himself to the American electorate by promising to go after the worst of the worst, the criminals, and it was just a lie. Just last week, I spoke with an old friend, someone I've known since I was a child. He's a contractor. He works with a very hardworking crew. They renovate bathrooms and medical offices and build homes. He told me he was out on a job with 8 laborers, and ICE pulled them over and zip-tied 4 of the guys, you know, who legitimately had papers for being in this country. And then they figured out where they lived and they went to their houses. They zip-tied their wives, and then they zip-tied the children. They zip-tied the children. So many of these stories don't make the news, but some of them managed to break through. A 7th grader kidnapped from school, sent to a prison 500 miles away from his parents. A 14-year-old girl assaulted by masked men in unmarked vehicles and shoved to the ground. A 15-year-old American citizen locked in a garage for 5 hours without informing his parents. Babies and children being separated from their mothers. Meanwhile, the Trump family has enriched itself at least $3 billion in this past year. The administration is slashing American jobs, undermining the workforce and consumer protections, and bailing out Trump's corrupt buddies. Like Javier Milei, right, the president of Argentina, whose collapsing economy has received, is it $20 billion of $40 billion US taxpayer dollars. So zip-tied children and financial corruption, these things might seem dissimilar, but they're actually linked. So today I want to connect the dots. And then I want to pivot to what we can and must do in response. But first I want to tell you a little bit about my own journey and how I got here. It began nearly 17 years ago. My husband and children, very young kids, were living in Santa Barbara, California. We learned that a Good News Club was coming to our daughter's public elementary school. For those of you who aren't familiar, although Good News Clubs are here too, they're after-school clubs that install themselves in elementary schools targeting children in their very earliest years of learning, with a message that if they don't believe in Jesus and go to the right kind of church, they're going to go to hell. You know, a centerpiece of their program has no words, just it's called a wordless book. It's got pictures and shapes and colors. It's used to convert children who are too young to read. I saw how adults leading the clubs were using their position inside the school to get kids attending the clubs to recruit their peers to the club or to target their classmates, particularly those of religious minority groups, with the message that they were going to go to hell. I could really only describe this as a form of faith-based bullying and bigotry. They were confusing kids into thinking that their public schools endorse this kind of religion. So a little girl named Ashley targeted her friend Zoe on the playground. These are two 6-year-old kids. We knew Zoe. Ashley tells her, "You don't believe in Jesus, so you're going to go to hell." And Zoe, who's a member of a religious minority group, only one in her class, says that's not true. The teachers overheard this exchange, and they explained that different religions believe in different things, right? Zoe was okay with this. But Ashley, the little girl attending the Good News Club, she started to cry. And she said, "I know it must be true because they don't teach things that aren't true in school. How can they lie to us in school?" And that gets to the heart of my problem with the Good News Club. I don't have a problem with kids talking with their friends about religion at school. But I do have a problem with kids being deceived into thinking that their public school endorses a very particular form of the Christian faith and then using that misinformation to bully their peers. Moms in our community who I knew sent their kids to the club thinking, "Oh, I want my kids to receive some religious education and it's in such a convenient location." And they were shocked when their kids came home and said, "Mom, we're going to go to hell because we attend a Catholic church." Our school happened to be down the road from Westmont College. It's a very well-regarded evangelical college. And the parent body at our school was, I would say, a third to half evangelical. But even my evangelical friends who were moms at the school, they didn't want a Good News Club coming there either. You know, evangelicalism is actually quite diverse, as every other religion is diverse. So a group of them met with the Good News Club leaders and said, "We too are evangelical. We believe in the Great Commission, but you're not right for our school." They offered them free and better space in the church next door to the school. The Good News Club leaders declined. And that set off alarm bells in my head. I thought, why don't they want to be in this beautiful church next door to the school for free? What do my evangelical friends know that I don't? And how is this legal and possible, given the constitutional principle of the separation of church and state? So that's really where my journey began. I learned about the well-funded legal advocacy organizations and legal strategists working on behalf of the Good News Club and organizations like it. I learned about the policy groups and think tanks with which they were connected. I learned about the pastoral networks that they drew from. I started to dig into the funding for all of this. And look, I'm an investigative reporter. I always feel like you don't know what's happening unless you're in the room where it's happening. So I thought, if they have a right to come to our public school, I have a right to go to their national convention, and I did. And what I saw was really astonishing. The contempt with which the leaders and key strategists of the Child Evangelism Fellowship, which is the group behind the Good News Club, the sort of contempt for public education just blew me away. They described our public schools, the schools that they were exploiting for their clubs, as scenes of spiritual battle. They described other people's children as the harvest and our schools as their mission fields. This was a movement that claimed to stand for small-town values and the integrity of the American family, and yet they were treating our small town and families that didn't look like theirs with contempt. I came to realize that their actions were part of a much larger effort to undermine public education, and the attack on public ed was just one part of a larger effort, a movement to destroy the institutions and foundations of American democracy. This movement is not remotely conservative. A true conservative movement would want to preserve the institutions and principles that have served us over time, right? This is a movement with a radical vision to remake America along authoritarian lines. Now, at the time, of course, Obama was the president. The big story in religion news was the rise of the so-called nuns, but it was clear to me even then that people outside the movement had no idea how organized this movement was, how well funded it was, and how ambitious and radical its aims. The Christian nationalist movement long preceded Donald Trump, and it will outlast him. But make no mistake, it is the movement that brought him to power. Much of the movement functions as a giant voter turnout machine. Many people still wonder, how is it possible that a movement that claims to stand behind someone who embodies none of those purported family values they claim to care about, how could they support him? Well, they compare him to a biblical king, like a King Cyrus figure, an imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will. Now, here's the thing about kings. They're not democratic figures. They are the law unto themselves. Trump disregards the law, any law or constitutional principle or amendment that he doesn't like. This makes him the perfect representative of a movement that doesn't believe in democracy, doesn't believe in its institutions or its principles. So Trump himself violates the norms and he breaks the rules. A leader who flouts the law out in the open wants people to believe that the law simply doesn't matter anymore, and that all that matters is his will. This is how you break democracy itself. So I want to shift a bit and talk about authoritarianism. And I want to suggest that sometimes it's misunderstood. Authoritarianism is not a full-fledged political program that the rank and file necessarily endorse, sort of like religious nationalism, when people might cast their vote to say, defend the American family. They might not be making major, an argument for major changes for the way our government is run. They're just kind of making a statement about their values, right, and themselves. But with their actions, voting for these candidates, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. And it's the same with authoritarianism. It's sort of, the growth of authoritarianism is often brought about by the coordinated actions of distinct groups that might not be fully aware of the consequences of their collective actions. So in my journey through this world, I've met I go to a lot of right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings, and I've met a lot of frankly nice people who love their families, they care about their neighbors, they truly believe they're doing something good for America. All of their good intentions have been harnessed in service of an agenda that is weakening our nation, not strengthening it. It's harming our economy. It's weakened our position in the world. It's dividing our communities, eliminating chances of reasoned discourse, and leading to dangerous levels of polarization. The attack on democracy that we see unfolding in the United States right now, it's therefore best seen not as the work of any single ideology, but of a kind of pathology. And in my latest book, I showed that this pathology is hitting on three fronts: money, lies, and God, by which I mean the exploitation of religion. So when I use the word God in my title, I'm not speaking about the whole of Christianity or any single theology. Instead, I'm referring to a certain political use or appropriation of certain kinds of religion and the suppression or denigration of other kinds of religion. In the American context, this includes the denigration of forms of Christianity that emphasize love, empathy, the social gospel. Instead, it elevates obedience, punishment, an us versus them mentality, and hierarchies supposedly ordained of God. You know, I was recently last December, actually, at the Turning Point USA's big gathering. It's called America Fest. It was December after the election, and there are 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters there. Honestly, this is like the angriest group of winners I'd ever met. And, you know, you've got Steve Bannon over there calling for old-time, Old Testament retribution. But I was really interested in this fellow named Lucas Miles, who's the head of Turning Point USA Faith. That's a really powerful position for a really powerful organization. And he had authored a book titled Woke Jesus, the False Messiah, Destroying the Christian Church. Well, what counts as woke Jesus, right? He specified, he said it came in the 1700s, started to come in the 1700s with the social gospel, with the historical Jesus movement, with liberation theology and black liberation theology. He had to get that in there. Think about that. The social gospel, which I think many, if not most American Christians think of as the gospel, is heresy. And he said he's made it his mission to eradicate wokeism from Christianity. So, Reverend Tony, when you spoke about how UU churches and other sort of moderate and liberal churches could be targeted, you know, that's real. Religious nationalism is not remotely unique to America or to Christianity. And, you know, it's all about insiders versus outsiders, who you are, what tribe you're from. In America, we're trained to think about this kind of identity politics as something that is practiced by and for minority groups. But identity politics, I think, is practiced harder by the right today. There are groups that feel they are a majority, or should be a majority, or want to cast themselves as the authentic representatives of the entire nation. This kind of religious nationalism in its extreme form is an authoritarian's best friend. Organizations like Freedom House and the World Population Review offer maps that score every country on measures of freedom. Now, there's some variation amongst the scores, and of course we have to understand that there are nuances specific to different countries and regions. But broadly speaking, the maps that show that countries that are the most religious nationalist are overrepresented as the most unfree. Discrimination against women, religious minorities, and other disfavored groups is endemic. Journalists are censored or persecuted. Political opposition is squelched. Unsurprisingly, these countries are also amongst the most oligarchic and corrupt. Sometimes this is easier to see when it's happening in other countries. When you have leaders like Putin in Russia, or Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran. When these leaders bind themselves tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries in order to consolidate authoritarian power, we rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism. But if we examine these countries, we'll see that they're not pure theocracies necessarily. Of course, there's an official religion, and the government attempts to impose its values on the entire population. But these countries are better understood as cronyistic kleptocracies, right, that make use of political religion as one among several tools, which also include the brutal suppression of their own populace and the squelching of free speech and political opposition. Why do authoritarians love religious nationalism so much? Well, part of it is distraction. If you can get people focused on culture war issues and outrage politics, we're seeing a lot of that today, right? They won't notice that their leaders are enriching themselves and their friends at the public's expense. And that's exactly what's happening in America today. The other part of it, I mean, we are seeing a kind of corruption that we have never seen before in our country. We've seen corruption in the past. You know, Harding with his teapot domes, or Nixon trying to subvert the Department of Justice. By the way, he was ousted by his own party for trying to do that. But the kind of corruption we're seeing today with, billions of dollars of self-enrichment and Qatari palaces in the sky and the like, and meme coin schemes and crypto schemes, etc. There's just nothing remotely comparable in our history. The other reason authoritarians love religious nationalism is fear. More specifically, it's about giving people an enemy so vile and hateful that any and all measures against it are imperative. It's about creating this sense of crisis, of emergency, to justify the breaking of democratic norms and the dismantling of guardrails. It's about creating scapegoats so that the people won't recognize the real, genuine sources of their challenges. So what are the real sources? Well, we'll start with the first word in the title of my book, money. In the run-up to the 2020 election, I heard Franklin Graham, you guys know who he is, right? And I heard him explain his support, for our current president. He said, "We are nostalgic for the America of the late 1950s and of the 1950s and early 1960s. And Donald Trump is nostalgic for that America too. And that's why we support him." Okay, let's do a thought experiment right now. Let's set aside the fact that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act weren't even passed until the mid-1960s. They might be nostalgic for that too, but let's just as a thought, thought experiment, let's set that aside. Let's set aside Jim Crow, rampant discrimination against black people, against women, and other groups. Let's just set all of that aside and look at what else was happening in that period. In the 1950s, the average American CEO earned 17 times the salary of the American worker, right? Not bad. He could buy a second house. It was always a he, almost always. A country club, private school for the kids, maybe a boat. You could have a pretty nice life, right? Now let's compare that to what's happening today. The average CEO of an American Fortune 500 company earns about 300 times the salary of the average American worker. 17 then versus over 300 today. Many of those CEOs have fifth and sixth homes along with underground bunkers where they believe they can retreat to safety if the dystopian economy that they have helped to create implodes. They've got these bunkers. Over the past decades, we've seen a massive upward concentration of wealth at the very tippy top of the economic ladder, along with a hollowing out for the middle and working classes. Just look at a few statistics. The amount of wealth created for the 19 richest American families in 2024 is $1 trillion. It's a lot of money. And by the way, Elon Musk, I think he just got a $1 trillion payout, and he gets a lot of government contracts, privileged government contracts, and billions in taxpayer subsidies for his business, for his monopolistic businesses. Since 2005, the bottom 90% of America has owned less than the top 1% of America. The decline in the average tax rate for the top 0.1% of Americans since 1933 is about 50%. I actually think it's less because that's 1933 to 2020. I think it's even less now. So it's declined 50%, while the average increase in the tax rate for bottom 90% of Americans from that same period is 150%. So the bottom 90% is paying 150% more, and those at the top 0.1 are paying a whole lot less. This has created a population with real and legitimate grievances. You've got 2 parents, 4 jobs, and they're still struggling to afford a decent life for themselves. Young adults, anybody has young adults in this room, just out of college, or really having a hard time supporting themselves and feeding themselves, let alone starting a family. The anti-democratic movement is very good at harnessing these grievances, harnessing the sense of loss and anxiety, and hurling these anxieties, creating an enemy or scapegoat to blame, then hurling all this anger at their political enemies. Often the story of inequality is framed as a matter of fairness. It just seems unfair that a few people get to own mega yachts while so many others have to sink or swim. But the big issue, as far as I'm concerned, isn't just about fairness. It's also about power. The kind of inequality we have now means giving tremendous amounts of power to people who happen to hold oligarchic wealth. You know, over the past decades, billions of dollars have flowed into this anti-democratic movement. Much of it has come from a sector of extremely wealthy individuals and foundations who invest in think tanks, policy groups, networking organizations that link up hard-right economic ideologies that benefit and justify plutocratic wealth with the culture war positions that get the rank and file to vote in their favor. So if you can get people voting on this distraction over here, this culture war distraction, usually involving sexuality or something, or you know, immigrants, whatever, they are not going to be focusing on the real sources of the problems that they face. And it's very upsetting, of course, that a lot of decisions that matter, like where the federal government should spend its money, and who it should hire and fire, and what we're going to do about tech and media, these decisions are not in the hands of elected officials. Instead, they're in the hands of unelected billionaires and their 22-year-old minions. So some of these billionaires are investing very heavily in misinformation and propaganda, so the public won't figure out how badly they're being screwed. Which brings me to the third front in the war on democracy: lies. Frederick Douglass said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, he said, "Tyrants fear nothing more than free speech, because truth is the great enemy of all oppressors. When truth is in peril, democracy is in peril." If religious, he's right about that. I mean, if religious nationalism is an authoritarian's best friend, the control of media and the suppression of critical voices are among its favorite tools. Russia, Hungary, Turkey, China, these and other oppressive governments have converted information media into disinformation media and propaganda. They manipulate and control people, and they do that by separating them from the facts. Their leaders tell the people they're working for them, even as they work to enrich a political and financial elite. Authoritarian leaders do everything they can to destroy the freedom of speech, on which democracy depends. Disinformation is as old as politics, of course, but we're really at a new level. We have these think tanks that were created over decades, not to help people think about anything, but instead to promote talking points or strings of falsifications. We've turned our data and our information processing assets over to private actors in the tech business whose profit comes not from how well they inform us, but how well they manipulate us, many of whom have a long and proven history of reactionary thinking and hostility to equality. I'm thinking about Peter Thiel, of course, and Elon Musk, and David Sachs. We have a media sector that's fallen into the hands of individuals and market leaders whose profits come not from informing us, but from providing us with clickbait. Much of the public policy we're seeing in America today is all about performative cruelty. It's meant to put on a show, to promote this or that authoritarian narrative. It's about dominance displays, the ritual punishment of political enemies, the scapegoating of targets. Donald Trump may have been the perfect person to take us down the hallway that leads us from democracy to autocracy. But make no mistake, many Americans in public and private worked long and hard to build that hallway and to roll out the red carpet. You know, whether the anti-democratic movement can destroy American democracy for good, or whether it will succeed can't be known. But I like to think of it as, you know, the concrete is being poured, but it hasn't hardened yet, you know? So there is still time to act, and What those of us who believe in the promise of America should do now is pretty clear. I agree with founding father Thomas Paine that the cause of America is the cause of humankind. I continue to believe that for all of its missteps and imperfections and difficult periods of history, America has been part of a project to make the world reasonable and free. It has been, in many ways, a source of progress. It has been great precisely because the principles of pluralism and equality and justice that represent the American promise. Ideals to work for. Never perfectly achieved, of course, but these are principles to work for, and they're worth defending. I think there are some people who are trying to take our country in a different direction, and I think many of you do too. So now is not the time to curl up in despair. We have institutions to protect, pro-democracy organizations to support, lawsuits to pursue, corruption to expose, and midterm elections in this coming year. The same forces that have brought us an anti-democratic movement have succeeded in undermining its key institutions, the integrity of the judiciary, the integrity of religious organizations, right? The guardrails of one of our two major political parties. If we want better outcomes, we can start by learning how those institutions have been undermined and then commit ourselves to the process of restoring them and improving them. It takes time for the autocrat to consolidate control. This is something to remember. We're still free to have these gatherings and to act, so we should do so while we can, right? We have to remain engaged. We need to focus on strategic and broad-based actions that have appeal, broadly speaking. And there's room for all kinds of targeting. The religious right is good at turning out their base and going after low-propensity voters. And, I hear in liberal spaces a lot of talk about, how do we reach my Trumpy uncle and how do we break through? Well, speaking from personal experience, sometimes you can have those conversations with all of the sort of full heart empathy and listening skills at your at disposal, and you can do that for 10 years and still not make much of a dent. I think sometimes it's better to go after people who are like-minded, who see through some of the nonsense, to turn out the base, hold people accountable to voting, and then go after people who feel disenfranchised or maybe didn't vote in the last election. Maybe they didn't know how. Maybe they weren't registered. And people should not be shamed for that. There are a lot of people who are starting to see through the false promises. They should not be shamed. We have to welcome people where they are. So we should be working with like-minded organizations, even if we don't agree on everything. By embracing a big tent mentality, we should be collaborating, and we can collaborate with those who share at least a majority of our goals. To paraphrase a former president, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. We're not going to get everything we want. None of us are. We're like a big family with lots of kids. No one's going to get everything they want. This one wants a pony, that one wants an ice skating rink. It's not going to happen. But if we can agree more than we disagree on, we can and should work together. So there are things we can do as individuals and things we do better when we join together with others. If you don't find a pro-democracy organization or initiative that satisfy you, start your own. Work to educate others about the bigger forces at risk. A lot of this filters to the local level. I know a lot of you guys are very engaged in local community initiatives here, and that's really important. If we sit out the school board stuff and the library stuff, you know who shows up? Moms for Liberty. So it's really important to show up for those things. And I think it's also really important to build networks of support and kindness and mutual aid. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, but there is no shortage of avenues for engagement. Finally, I want to point out that there is nothing more meaningful than being part of the struggle for democracy. It won't be easy, and there are no guarantees. Freedom is not a guarantee. I bet every single person in this room has an ancestor somewhere in the world at some point in history who had to fight for their freedom. And if they could do it, we can do it. And we owe it not just to ourselves, but for future generations. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd love to take some questions if anybody, I guess we'll maybe do a Q&A until 8:15, and then I see one in the back.
Lisa, straight back.
Oh, I am so sorry.
So I have noticed that our media has become very insular. Radio stations seem to all be owned by one or two big corporations. Our regular, quote, TV stations, the people who brought us Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather and all those other great news people seem to be getting consolidated into great corporations. And of course, the streaming networks and our newspapers all seem to be getting consolidated into great corporations, which means that great corporations are soon going to control everything we think we know. What do we do about that?
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you brought that up. We're seeing a tremendous amount of media consolidation, but also in the hands of pro-Trumpy billionaires. I think about like Larry Ellison and his son David, whose Skydance Media merged with another company that they want to acquire Warner Discovery, which includes the sort of crown jewel of television, which is CNN, and Trump is kind of putting his thumb on the scales, allowing them potentially to acquire Warner Discovery. And what's happened is that other big media corporations they kind of get the message. They're like, oh, I guess we've got to donate $10 million to Trump's, gold-plated ballroom if we want a chance at making the deals we want to make. And so you're right, the media consolidation is very challenging. Right now, I think it's something like 40% of local TV stations are in the hands of three big companies, including Sinclair, which has a very strong sort of reactionary hardline bias, and they're in like 80% of the market. So when you have this kind of consolidation of information in the hands of people at the tippy top who understand that to play ball, they've got to please the regime and its leader, we're really dealing with a new era of misinformation, and it's deeply challenging. I mean, the answer to any of this stuff is political power. You can't make good policy unless you have enough political power to make it. So, I remember Ralph Reed years ago at one of the gatherings that I was at. He's one of the movement's most astute and seasoned strategists. He leads it's called what's wrong? Faith and Freedom Coalition. And every year he runs a big conference called Road to Majority. And he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he is right. We, those of us who want to live in a democracy, would prefer a democracy than some sort of kleptocratic, cronyistic, oligarchic, autocracy, are the majority. We just need to act like it. The movement succeeds because they turn out votes in disproportionate numbers.
Thank you. You have talked about the billionaires, and you've mentioned a couple of the religious leaders, but can you give us a sense of who else we should be listening to, number one, And what are the struggles within them? Because these people are likely going to try and take over and have minds bigger, you know, that sort of
Thank
stuff.
you. You know what's interesting about the people that are donating huge amounts of money, the funders as I call them, religiously speaking, they're all over the place. Some of them are evangelical, like the Wilkes brothers or Tim Dunn. Some of them are Protestant. Some of them are Catholic, like Sean Filer, or I think some of them are Jewish, like Barry Seid, a Chicago billionaire who donated $1.6 billion to create the Marble Freedom Trust and put Leonard Leo, an ultra-conservative Catholic leader, in charge of it. And they funnel money into Heritage and the Alliance Defending Freedom and some of the other key organizations within the movement. So, and some of them are atheistic. I think about these some of the tech bros who may adopt a religious identity, I think, for quasi-strategic purposes, but they really aren't motivated by religion. They're really motivated by, I would say, the desire to increase oligarchic wealth or justify the massive amount of wealth that they're accumulating, and a kind of reactionary mentality. It's more culturally reactionary rather than religious right. I mean, I have a lot of names in my book. The list is really too long to go into right now. But what's also interesting is there's a whole set of, beyond those big funders, there's a whole subset of funders who are still donating a lot of money, but whose names are not well known at all.
Catherine, I have a question for you. I'm totally impressed with how you've done your research. You've really been in the weeds and have seen all of these organizations firsthand. Have you felt in your research that there is a definite force or movement to stop us from having midterm elections?
I can't predict the future. I think we've seen already that this is a movement that disputes the consequences of elections it doesn't like. We saw that in 2020. Even before that election, Trump and many of his allies started spreading this idea that, the election was going to be stolen, and then afterwards, they all went all in. I mean, a lot of religious right leaders were all in on that. There were a few, like Robert Jeffress, who was a big Trump ally, who said, well, the election is, I'm paraphrasing here, well, the election has been, decided. And then he sort of quickly got the message that nobody else was saying this, and then he sort of backpedaled. So I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see.
I wonder if you'd share some thoughts about Citizens United and perhaps what the future of that might be or what could be done about it.
Thank you so much. I can't predict the future again, but again, this is, in advance of the elections, I heard many leaders of the movement say things like, this election is about judges, judges, judges. And I think a lot of folks who really weren't enamored of Donald Trump cast their vote because they had been told, they understood that elections matter because judges matter, judicial appointments really matter. So I think one thing those of us who believe in democracy can do is trying to help people connect the dots. We can't forget that in the 2024 election, if you look at the number of eligible voters, Donald Trump won about the same proportion of eligible votes that he won in 2020, but there was diminished enthusiasm for voting on the Democratic side of the aisle. A lot of people were divided. I'm not crazy about her. I don't like this or that. But, had they thought a little bit harder about the judges, about the people who would be appointed to lead different divisions, and about more than just who they want to sit down and have a coffee with, election might have gone a different way.
I thought your book had amazing level of detail. I just couldn't believe all the research you must have done. I was struck when you discussed organizations. I mean, we all know about Heritage and Project 2025, but there was a group out of California that I'd never heard of, a think tank. Can you speak some more to those other groups that are, with billionaire money, plotting our future?
I'm not sure what think tank you're referring to. Was it this specific?
Was it? I don't want to say Claremont, but it was something
Oh,
like
the
that.
Claremont Institute.
Yes, Claremont
Yeah,
Institute.
Claremont Institute is really interesting. They have been a key organization in the development of a movement called the New Right, which is less explicitly religious nationalist in its orientation, but more explicitly anti-democratic. And if we look at a document like Project 2025, which, as you guys know, is that 900-page blueprint in advance preparing for the next Trump administration, it's kind of a marriage of those two groups, the religious right and the new right. I think of these two groups as the power couple of American authoritarianism. You know, early in its iteration, the Claremont Institute, it was always conservative, but it was really seeking to bolster America's founding principles. And, you know, it really hadn't gone off the rails, but something happened over the years. You know, it was taken over by different leadership, and the folks they're giving fellowships to, some of them were very considered very fringe at the time, and then all of a sudden these very fringe, radical, you know, hardline ideas have really moved to the center, not just the center of, you know, of the new right, but now, unfortunately, to the center of American politics.
Thank you. Say, right over here in the very back. Way back here. Hi. Hey, I pretty well listen to the BBC to try and get the real news and so forth, or other news organizations. What news organizations, or are there any that you rely on? Because there is just too much slander and opinions, and just trying to get people riled up so they'll continue to watch. Yeah, I just want the news.
Thank you so much.
You rely on?
Well, I've got to give a big shout out to NPR. We have someone right here in the front. My reading is all over the map, as you can imagine. You know, I read what the right is saying. I read, you know, what the left is saying. I read the center. I still read the New York Times. The Washington Post still has some very good reporting, even though their op-ed section is kind of, you know, gone in this different, strange direction. They'll write about personal freedoms, but of course they're not writing about, you know, the personal, like many of the personal freedoms that I cherish. They're in a sort of regime-friendly direction. But yeah, I read all kinds of stuff. And I think it's, when you mention the BBC, I think America used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine, which was established to ensure that, you know, you could have different representatives of different sides of an issue, but you're not going too far off the center. And you know, it's like you can have your different opinions, but you're going to agree on the same facts. The BBC functions in this way for the UK, where you'll see something about road safety, and you'll see somebody talk about, oh, I think we should increase how quickly cars can go, and somebody else is saying, no, we should slow it all down. So you get both sides of the issue, but you know, it serves to kind of stabilize the population, to reduce polarization, to keep people talking to one another, to show that people can talk with different political opinions, but can still agree on the same facts. Unfortunately, we don't have the Fairness Doctrine anymore, and so people are living in their information silos, and it is a real problem.
Okay, thank you for coming back to talk with us. You know, when I go on the bus out to concentration camp Alcatraz, I feel I do something that matters. And I think it's very easy to sort of get overwhelmed and think you have no power. But I do believe we have a lot of power if we just know where to focus. So you've mentioned names who are involved. on the opposite side of what I am. Can you give us some local names?
Some what names?
Local names or businesses? I don't go to Home Depot anymore. I go to Lowe's. Because I think that's where we have some power.
Yeah, right. Well, you can read my books. There are a lot of names. I'm hesitant to sort of say anything out here, single out any one organization. But yeah, in the course of my research, I've been kind of surprised to learn that some of the brands that I saw every day were run by folks who actually were lending support to this movement. I remember when I was researching my last book, Power Worshippers, I went to this gathering out in Tulare. It was the 20th anniversary of this guy named Ralph Drollinger, his ministry. At the time, in the first administration, he was doing Bible study in the West Wing, and 11 out of 15 members of Trump's cabinet were attending. And it was this incredibly hardline theology. He was very frankly contemptuous of women having any kind of power. It was really this idea that, certain people have a right to rule and others have a duty to obey, including the workforce. He compared this to sort of like the correct biblical slavery, where, you respect your masters or something. He used this to describe the correct relation between a worker and a boss. And, he sort of drew it theologically through Rushduni. I'm not going to get into the details about this. But what was interesting to me is he was talking about, my ministry grew up on dairy and carrots. I'm like, dairy and carrots? I realized that there are some dairy bosses, not all by any means, but some dairy bosses that were donating a lot of money to his ministry and got him started. Carrots. There was like a company, Bolt House, which then was later taken over by people who are not part of that family. So you can still eat your carrots in good conscience, even if they come from Bolt House. They do salad stuff, and it's not run by that family anymore. It's been sold off, but early in the career. And then there was various things you see in the grocery store. I would look at the label and be like, oh my gosh, they donate to his ministry. So that was kind of surprising. Oh, I just learned about him. That's really interesting. I was really hoping to go to that grocery store. I thought that would be fun. I wish I had an extra day.
Hello. Your discussion is very sophisticated. You hit it right when you suggested there were 10 million fewer voters in the last election than in the previous. Affordability is the word. I haven't heard you talk about that yet. I think affordability is going to be a more powerful argument than the sophisticated argument you have, which I respect very much. What do you think about how will your message change, if at all, given what you've just learned about affordability?
Yeah, well, in my book, the first word in the title is money. So I talk about increase of wealth. I talk about the hollowing out of life for the middle and working classes. And that is an overwhelming message in my book. Thank you so much.
Katherine, what do you think of the 8 Democratic senators who crossed the aisle to join with their Republican, quote-unquote, brethren to
thank you for that
pass
question.
the continuing resolution?
I'm going to confess that I have been traveling over these last days and on airplanes. In fact, on airplanes that get bumped. So on flights that it was a drama getting here. So that was the day when all of that was happening, and frankly, I just did not have a chance to. I don't feel like I've really dug in enough to have an educated opinion at this point, because this is just happening now. Thank you.
Hi, I work in tech, and I have for about 15 years. And I'm sure you've noticed that the seemingly active denigration of all of the sources of information. Google has actively gotten worse. Like you try to search for something and it's just ads and clickbait, and they refer you off to some shady places. And I find myself in my day-to-day life talking to my friends, and they just reference all of this, stuff they saw on TikTok or whatever. Do you have any pointers or tips? Because you've gone to the belly of the beast with CPAC or the America Fest of how to talk to people who've been ingesting this kind of misinformation, how to maybe get them to see the light. And I know you just can't throw facts at them, but.
Yeah, I think it's always worth having the conversations if it doesn't drive you crazy. You have to sort of figure out where you're at, do I have the energy for this now? And then try to inject information in a kind of, say, well, and sometimes people take it and sometimes they don't. Yeah. I mean, it's people are so different. I've been able to help people see things a different way, and then there's some people who will be like, oh, that's fake news,
So
Okay.
Liberty Vote just bought Dominion voting systems, and Liberty Vote is run by a Republican. That so much as a statement, it's a little scary. How important is it for us to really get out there, go to school board meetings, go to county meetings with county commissioners, city commissioners, to really get involved?
Thank you. It is really important. A lot of the stuff filters to the local level, and the right is really good at mobilizing local activists. This is a lot of what these initiatives like Moms for Liberty are about. They're about getting people involved in the first level of local activism, and then hopefully finding some who are going to sort of run for office or take more initiative. And if we, I understand life is really busy. Sometimes you just want to sit it out. But if we cede that ground, then to the right, then we're going to end up with policies that we might not be so happy about. I mean,
Okay.
Nobody can do all of it, right? So pick your lane and find a friend to bring with you and make it fun if you can.
Yeah, I just wanted to indicate I read your book and was thoroughly impressed, and I've been telling everybody.
Thank you so much.
That they must read it. But I think besides the fact that it was very well researched, and I was impressed by how you could go to that many right-wing meetings and keep your sanity. But as people who are living in Collier County, Florida, the thing that stuck out to me was your mention of Erica and Byron Donalds. Erica has her schools here, and Byron, of course, is the congressman from this area. And also the ties you mentioned from DeSantis and other people who at the top, but I think a lot of us sort of know about, but you really honed in on how deeply they are really involved in this worldwide movement. And I'm not sure you expressed tonight either how really worldwide, as you did in your book, that this movement is.
Thank you so much. Somebody said to me right before I came up here, Florida in 2023 is like Project 2020. Who said that? It's what's happening nationally is actually often workshopped in Florida first. You guys see it. You see it. So, Florida's a laboratory for even, what was that, New College? That takeover of New College? So.
We have time for about 3 more questions. If we can ask, please rise when you ask the questions.
I'm wondering if you could compare for us the progress between your book power worshipers and money lies and God, what has transpired between 1 and 2?
Thank you so much. We're not in the warning stage anymore. It's happening. It's like the concrete is being poured, you know. And maybe back then the concrete was being mixed, and now it's being poured. So, you know, the time to act is now. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. My name's Erin. I've been in healthcare for about 16 years. I'm actually going to get my master's degree at the end of January. And lately, as I'm sure everyone is aware, is the increasing attacks on healthcare and science as a whole. And so I was interested to hear maybe your thoughts on if there's a strategy on their end with that.
Science depends on reason and reasonable processes. And, you know, it seems, why would this administration want to destroy the scientific research apparatus that has been the source of our economic success and made us the envy of the world? It doesn't seem to make sense. But first you have to remember that science depends on the facts, and dictators understand, you know, the truth is inimical to dictatorial power. And it also is like an undermining of science, you know, the principles of reasoned principles. You know, if you can sort of undermine those principles, then you're undermining the idea that the truth matters. The other thing is that the movement has this idea that they want to control institutions of democracy. They want them to serve their agenda and not some other agenda. So the takeover of universities is part of that. You know, and attacking scientific grants is a big part of attacking universities, weakening them in order to, what they'd like to do is to bring them under their control and make them regime friendly. Thank you.
I just wanted to address the person in the back that was concerned about media consolidation and just let you know that we hope at Public Media to be the answer to that, because you are our only stakeholders. We're not owned by a company, we're owned by all of you.
I think that's great. Thank you.
And the only problem is we just need to get bigger. My colleagues around the country used to think that the people who didn't know about us, that it was almost their fault, and it is our fault. We need to make sure that we're speaking to more than the choir that we got the applause from today, and help everyone understand what's going on. So we have to get bigger to tell more of this country that we can come together.
Thank you. We've got one final question, and then...
Last question. When I look around this room, I see a lot of different organizations or activists. They don't come together. The way that MAGA advanced was because they became a movement. Everybody came together. How do you bring all these different organizations together to move things forward as a movement?
That's a really important point. We need to work together, and we need to understand that we can work together even if we don't agree on everything. We really do need to have a big tent and understand that if we agree on more than we disagree on, we can work together. As I said earlier, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. The other thing I want to note is that there are a lot of different folks who, I think most Americans, oppose the politics of conquest and domination that this movement represents, but lack the money behind the movement and lack the organizational capacity. But if we can, you know, there's no one coming to save us. We can save ourselves. So I think if people become more active and join together with others, there's a lot we can achieve. Thank you so much. Thank you.